Africa's future, particularly in matters of peace and security, cannot be outsourced.
Solutions africaines aux problèmes africains, ce qui a souvent fait défaut, c'est une volonté politique constante.
We have a lot within our own communities, our principles, that we can tap into to give power to African solidarity.
And to raise a new generation of African leaders who are ready to stand in the pressure room.
If China can do this in 46 years, Rwanda and Africa can do it in the coming 4 decades or so.
Hello and welcome to State of Africa. I'm Jeff Morte with the Africa Leadership and Dialogue Institute. Now this week, we delve into the dialogue and solutions from the International Security Conference on Africa. The gathering brought together security experts, civil society, researchers, and policymakers to examine the pressing security challenges facing the continent. The tone was firmly set by President Paul Kagame, who delivered a powerful opening address, urging Africa to be self-reliant, particularly when it came to security.
This forum is not only timely, it is long overdue. Africa's future, particularly in matters of peace and security, cannot be outsourced. For far too long, our security has been treated as a burden to be managed by others, with minimal input from us, and often without the benefit of our context or consent. This approach has failed to deliver both for Africa and for the world. What begins here is more than a conference. It is a deliberate effort to change both the narrative and the substance of how Africa engages with the global security debates. Moving forward, we must participate not from the margins, but as a credible and capable partner. To succeed, we have to focus on 3 critical pillars of action. The first is ownership. We cannot complain about external interference while at the same time creating the conditions that produce it. Sovereignty is not just about defending borders. It's about taking responsibility for our security, both as states and collectively as a continent. Neglecting this duty allows others to step in, leading to a loss of credibility and control. We also need to strengthen our continental institutions, namely the African Union and the Peace and Security Council within it, to handle our common security concerns. The second pillar is the link between governance and security. When one is weak, the other the other is compromised. Without both, there can be no trust and no meaningful progress. Security is not just about the absence of threats. Our job as leaders is to create an environment where people can live with dignity, enjoy their rights, and look to the future with hope and confidence. The third pillar is cooperation. Even with the best domestic systems in place, no country today can secure itself in isolation. None. Borderless threats like pandemics, terrorism, and cybercrime evolve very quickly, often faster than national responses. But cooperation must go beyond merely sharing information or joining forces in an ad hoc manner. It must be strategic, intentional, and innovative. The key to overcoming security challenges lies in our ability to produce our own solutions. Where we have capacity, we must scale it up. Where we lack it, this is the time and place to build it and also cooperate. The platform we are launching today must help align political will with technical expertise and national interests with continental priorities. Let us leave here not just informed, but more resolved to do more and better. I wish you productive deliberations in the days ahead.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, tout au long de mon parcours au sein de l'Union africaine et à travers mes engagements sur le terrain, j'ai mesuré l'ampleur de ce que nous pouvons accomplir lorsque nous faisons front commun. J'ai également été témoin du coût élevé de l'hésitation, des divisions et des engagements non tenus. Jamais l'ambition de nos instruments, notre architecture paix et sécurité notamment, n'a été remise en cause. Ce qui a souvent fait défaut, c'est une volonté politique constante, capable de traduire cette ambition en moyens concrets et en actions durables. La réalité est sans détour. La sécurité de l'Afrique ne saurait reposer sur des solutions importées. Solutions africaines aux problèmes africains, avons-nous l'habitude de dire et répéter. Elle doit s'ancrer dans nos propres diagnostics, refléter nos priorités et reposer sur notre capacité à intervenir de manière opportune et à l'échelle nécessaire. Face aux défis sécuritaires prégnants, il nous faut agir vite et avancer. Avancer signifie donner corps à notre vision. Cela requiert, entre autres, des mandats clairs, un financement pérenne, ainsi que des mécanismes efficaces opérant au niveau national, régional et continental. Notre action doit être résolument proactive, non réactive. Notre état de préparation doit être permanent et non conjoncturel. L'Union africaine demeure l'ancrage politique central de notre agenda sécuritaire commun. Mais aucune institution, si robuste soit-elle, ne saurait à elle seule porter une telle responsabilité. Il nous faut fortifier l'ensemble de l'écosystème africain de pensée stratégique, qu'il soit civil, militaire, académique ou diplomatique. L'ISCA comble un vide majeur. Elle offre un espace unique pour un débat rigoureux, une capacité d'alerte stratégique et une innovation politique féconde, où les données éclairent la décision et où l'analyse conduit à l'action. On ne saurait évoquer la sécurité sans parler du développement. Les causes profondes des conflits sur notre continent sont bien souvent d'ordre structurel et économique. Pauvreté persistante, inégalité criante, marginalisation de la jeunesse, promesses déçues. Ce ne sont pas seulement des échecs du développement, ce sont des facteurs majeurs d'insécurité. Chaque route non construite, chaque école fermée, chaque engagement non honoré fragilise davantage le tissu social de nos nations. À l'inverse, lorsque les institutions fonctionnent, lorsque les communautés sont autonomisées, lorsque les opportunités sont réelles et accessibles, la paix devient une expérience concrète et certainement durable. Nous devons aussi faire preuve de lucidité. Le poids de la sécurisation de notre continent ne peut reposer sur les épaules d'une poignée d'États. Le panafricanisme véritable ne se limite pas à une communauté d'idéaux. Il suppose un partage équitable des responsabilités, qu'il s'agisse des ressources, de coordination ou de volonté d'agir ensemble, même dans la diversité. C'est précisément pour cela que l'ISCA revêt une importance particulière. Si nous bâtissons cette plateforme avec clarté et détermination, elle s'inscrira durablement dans l'architecture de paix du continent. L'avenir que nous appelons de nos vœux ne saurait émerger du hasard. Il exige d'être façonné avec rigueur, lucidité et méthode, mais surtout, il exige d'être construit ensemble.
Africa's security and future cannot be outsourced. A strong message from President Kagame, calling for Africa to rethink its role in the global security debate. Leading that charge is former AU Chair Moussa Faki, now heading the ISCA Advisory Council as Africa navigates complex and shifting geopolitical terrain.
Security and peace for the continent, for the nations, and for our people. What are you seeing? And what are the priority areas we must address? You started us off, Your Excellency Moussa Faki. Let me come to you.
Nous nous sommes, en tant que continent, donné un certain nombre de moyens, notamment juridiques. Nous avons une architecture pour la paix, la sécurité. Mais le constat aujourd'hui est que nous ne sommes pas arrivés à rétablir la paix et la sécurité. Pourquoi? C'est une grande interrogation et c'est tout l'intérêt d'une structure comme l'ISCA pour pouvoir y réfléchir en profondeur. Vous l'avez dit, le droit international lui-même, qui a été construit, commence à être violé par ceux-là même qui l'ont mis en place et qui en détiennent pratiquement le monopole. Ça, c'est une grande interrogation. Quand on voit ce qui se passe aujourd'hui dans le monde, ce qui se passe à Gaza, ce qui se passe en Europe, ce qui se passe en Afrique, il y a de quoi s'interroger.
We need to think about that. And as a continent, it's all about responsibility. President Kagame said it earlier on. We need to own this and imagine what can be done, the solutions that can lead to peace and security. That's the the biggest stake that we need to think about? Thank you.
The troubles that Africa is facing are both made from within our own contradictions internally, in the structure of the African state, in the incentives of the political class, and the levels of competence that are available in terms of governing. And it is also the interaction with global forces and with actors who seek to intervene in different ways, whether it be political, commercial, or security. Perhaps the most benefit in terms of this particular remark is to build on our former chairperson's remark on responsibility. Julie, for the 2 years I recall being in the UN Security Council, I was exposed to many files, many African files as they're treated in the Security Council. And what I discovered is that to be free and to be secure is extremely demanding. As a government and as the leaders of governments, you need to have extreme levels of attentiveness, strategic thinking, and a complete rejection of domination of your mind and your intentions. And you have to do that not once in a while, you have to do that every single day. The sheer pressure to be competent and to be independent is overwhelming. And that is why the most necessary measures we need to take in the next coming years is to essentially begin to reshape the incentives of leadership and to raise a new generation of African leaders who are ready to stand in the pressure room. Because to lead your country in Africa towards security and towards prosperity requires special qualities that few single people have. It is usually groups of people. And how to produce them, how to motivate them, how to incentivize them, how to identify them and develop them is the most pressing challenge that we have today.
Thank you for that. Victor, let me come to you next. China has gone through an incredible evolution over the past few decades. It seems to have been very intentional, very strategic. But give us an overview. When you look at the geopolitical pressures and how they impact Africa, what are you seeing? And are there lessons in what China has done that you can share with the world and perhaps Africa could just take a look at?
Just like all of you, I listened very carefully to His Excellency President Kagame's important speech. I cannot agree with him more when he said African security cannot be outsourced. I think President Kagame is not only a great leader of Rwanda, he's a great leader of Africa, and is a great statesman in the world of today. Now, when you say you cannot outsource security to other countries, in a sense, it means Africa need to use your own brain power to make up your own judgment. In the world of today, you hear a lot of talks about whether, Africa should be forced to make a choice between China versus the United States. I think that's the wrong choice. The real choice for Africa, as well as for the rest of mankind, is whether the United States is doing the right thing or is doing the wrong thing, or whether China is doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing. If the United States is doing the right thing, work with the United States. But if the United States is doing the wrong thing, why should you bother about working with the United States or following its leadership? Similarly, if China is doing the right thing, why don't you want to work with China? And, God forbid, if China is doing the wrong thing, why should you work with China? That means African countries, people in Africa, need to use their own brain power to make a decision first, whether this country or that country is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Don't be forced by any other country to make a choice which will not serve your fundamental interest. Now, when I traveled a little bit in Rwanda yesterday, in Kigali, let me tell you my real observation. I think Kigali is in better shape today compared with China back in 1978, when China started to reform and opening to the outside world, attracting FDI into China. The philosophical point I want to emphasize is that if China can do this in 46 years, Rwanda and Africa can do it in the coming 4 decades or so. Have faith in yourself. Keep faith in yourself. China is a success story which can be repeated by the great people here in Rwanda and the great people here in Africa. Now, another piece of advice. What is the foundation upon which security should be based, not only for Rwanda but for Africa? Security never exists in a vacuum. Security should be based on several things, which are the pillars. One is maintain stability at home. The other one is keep peace with your neighbors. And the third one, as Deng Xiaoping, for whom I had the great honor to work with before, development is the hard truth. Develop, develop, develop. In that context, whichever country which can really help you to achieve your development goal, he should be a friend. But don't be diverted. Don't be confused by some other country coming to you, say, no, let's put a premium on certain other things, on values, etc. And I do not want to build a bridge or a highway or a railway or a power station in your country. But if those countries which build these infrastructure projects in your country, they are not really meant good for you. No, that's not the truth. Decide with yourself, use your own judgment as to which countries are really helping you to beef up infrastructure connectivity, your manufacturing capabilities, and in the African context in itself, power generation.
Security, which is the center of this panel, can also be understood as an economic, a political market with demand and offer. So with demand was explained clearly. It's not about outsourcing security. And when you talk about the offer, offer has become less and less. There's less will to involve militarily in other countries. And other countries, because you don't want to infringe on sovereignty. And so the security in terms of defense was not really what it should have been. And when you look at the theme of this panel, with this fragmented world, you see a multipolar world with geopolitical blocs that are competing against each other. And Africa's security is also related to security of other parts of the world. You see those conflicts outside of Africa have an impact on Africa. It's the case with Ukraine. And the consequences were felt in Africa, especially with food security, but also for defense proper. I've had a conversation with an African minister in West Africa after the invasion of Russia. So it became difficult for them to have essential military capacity to fight jihadists, because focus was more on aid to Ukraine, aid by the Western countries.
When the attack happened in Libya and Gaddafi was being taken down, a number of African presidents said, wait, hold. We will fly into Libya and we can have some kind of diplomatic conversations. The feedback from external actors to them was, if you fly into Libyan airspace, we cannot guarantee your security. I want you to think about that for a minute, that heads of state of the African continent were told this on our continent. And ladies and gentlemen, What is Libya today? When the attack happened in Libya and Gaddafi was being taken down, a number of African presidents said, wait, hold. We will fly into Libya and we can have some kind of diplomatic conversations. The feedback from external actors to them was, if you fly into Libyan airspace, we cannot guarantee your security. I want you to think about that for a minute. That heads of state of the African continent were told this on our continent. And ladies and gentlemen, what is Libya today? What is Libya today? And it happened on our watch. It happened on our watch. Ladies and gentlemen, Rwanda 1994. Dilly-dallying over the word genocide at the United Nations Security Council saw 1 million people dead in how many days? And who solved the problem? We had to solve the problem. His Excellency and a small force came back in and had to build this country from scratch, ladies and gentlemen. And today we still get lectures and hear lectures about human rights, and there's something wrong. I want to talk about South Africa today. In South Africa today, we are hearing narratives being built around white genocide in South Africa. You are security actors, you understand the import of these narratives and why are they being placed in the international scene? Why is this happening? What could it open up? Gaza today, ladies and gentlemen, where we've seen the brutalization and the massacre of tens of thousands of children. The multilateral systems, I'm going to come to each of you and ask, are they working? Can they hold? And if they cannot hold, and Africa has never been given an adequate seat at the table, Martin, you can talk about that, perhaps I'm wrong, you can correct me. But where does Africa stand? 54 nations? A strong continent, resource-rich, fastest-growing continent in the world. Where do we deserve to sit? Your Excellency, let me come to you on this. Multilateral systems and how do we maneuver this very serious reality, please?
These were heads of state, and their flight was refused. We had to negotiate until they arrived. What happened once they arrived in Libya? Gaddafi was ready to quit power. He was ready to step down. He said that to heads of state. Despite that, NATO intervened and went as far as assassinating him. Now, 15 years later, we see cases, court cases, Sarkozy being tried in France. You see, these are the consequences of such behavior. Now, Rwanda, 1994, we have a peacekeeping mission. We see genocidal tendencies and we look the other way. Today, the same type of peacekeeping mission is challenged. What about us as Africans? Have we succeeded? The model that we copied, does it correspond to our needs? And this brings us back to the idea of ownership. We should own our security, social, and political system. Our population needs to accept that system that we are proposing, and we need to position ourselves vis-à-vis the rest of the world. You said that in South Africa, Afrikaners are being given the refugee status in the US. Look, we have the history. Only a man like Mandela was able to impose a rainbow nation. Who is the victim in this? Who owns the land in South Africa? Who owns the land? I think everybody knows that. Now, you wanted to make South Africa and the ANC look like criminals, and you call them genocidal forces. That's not realistic. Maybe it is hiding something else behind, but this is not realistic. I think we need to be realistic, and this actually points to our weakness as a continent. I think all kinds of ideas are being experimented. This is one more reason for us as Africans to understand the depth and the risk that this situation represents. We need to do better and faster.
The United Nations was built primarily to prevent great war between the great powers. That's not all it was supposed to do, but this was its primary reason. And for that reason, it needed to have the great powers of the day to stay around the table and to be assured that the United Nations as a political construct would not be used against their vital interests as they saw them. The price of keeping them at the table was to give them the veto. And because of that ability to veto what the rest of the organization thinks or wants to do, and what all countries want or may want to do, it then assures that the permanent members will stay, and then posits that there'll be a possible diplomatic solution from that. In many ways, since we have not had a world war since 1945, you can say that the United Nations arrangement in its most basic terms has succeeded. But it has failed its promise to stop wars elsewhere. And often the veto power has been used to shield the allies and fellow travelers of the great powers when they're committing atrocities. The Security Council has been used as a platform to launch attacks against the very interests of Africa, for instance, the NATO attack on Libya. So what does Africa do in terms of this multilateralism that we belong to? One of the most ironic things about being an African diplomat in the UN is that you're often defending the very system that you're marginalized in. I find that all the time so strange. And I myself have been one of the more ferocious defenders of that system, even while understanding the inequities and marginalizations of my own continent from them. What it means is that the expectation of Security Council reform as a form of favor or an act of inclusion is naive. You do not get included in the permanent ranks of the Security Council to be a substantive member who can wield the veto just because. You have to generate your own form of power and independence so that you sit at that table as an equal. As I like to provoke, you can go to the Security Council permanent membership like a proud peacock, but you may emerge like a plucked chicken. Because the Security Council veto and permanent membership is only one dimension of national power that is arrayed against other intelligence, security, economic, and political powers. So the question for Africa when it comes to multilateralism is to go beyond the demand for inclusion and look inward and talk about the demand for leverage. What is it that allows Africa the leverage to sit in the permanent ranks? What is it that allows Africa to demand a seat at the table and to get it, not because we've been left out, but because of our leverage? And to me, Julie, that comes to coming back to our institutions, our security architectures, reimagining and re-energizing them, coming back to the original reasons we built the African peace and security architecture, being true to that architecture, making sure that the parts of it that have been captured or diverted by others are retaken back into our hands so that we're able to use them. Finally, when it comes to some of those particular emergencies that you talked about, from Gaza to Sudan and elsewhere, it seems to me that it doesn't take 193 members of the UN to decide on anything for the UN to move. What it requires is for a committed group of leaders, 5, 6, less than 10 committed African leaders can shift and change the multilateral system to be more responsive to Africa's definition of its interests. And those interests include the self-determination of the Palestinian people. And that's only because we ourselves are the products of self-determination. We can never turn away from it in principle or even politically. So leverage, leverage, leverage.
Several brief observations. First of all, the world order which we are living through, which was founded back in 1945, was never meant to be a unipolar world. And that's the reason why you have the Security Council, you have the 5 permanent member states, and each of them have the veto power. Therefore, if you hear any country in the world today saying it is the only surviving hegemon in the world, false, because it does not represent the legitimacy of the international order established back in 1945 after defeating Nazi Germany in the European theater and the Japanese fascism in the Asian Pacific theater. So we should be very proud members in the world community based upon multipolarity and multilateralism centered around the United Nations. Now, in more recent years, especially after the war in Ukraine and more recently the atrocities committed in Gaza against the civilians, we hear a lot of complaints about the inefficiency and the sometimes failure of the United Nations. I agree with all these assessments. On the other hand, I also agree with the ambassador, because let's be the devil's advocate. I think the United Nations has at least achieved in one thing, that is the prevention of the outbreak of another world war ever since 1945. The relations between the General Assembly on the one hand and the Security Council on the other hand, and within the Security Council between those non-permanent member states versus the 5 permanent member states, and for the 5 permanent member states, each with a veto power, the relations, the dynamics are very, very complicated, very, very well-defined sometimes. And sometimes I think the real design is meant for an impasse, because you do not want to see any situation in the world getting out of control from a country-to-country war to become a regional war, and from a regional war to become a total world war again. So I think while we have lots of complaints about the United Nations, we need to take comfort in one thing. That is, it is actually successful in preventing the total outbreak of another world war. Now, what does that leave for Africa, for example? I think 2 things need to be done. First of all, Africa needs to be further consolidated and strengthened. African Union should really be more consolidated so that eventually, I hope personally, for all the Security Council meetings of the United Nations Security Council, there will always be a representative representing Africa. So it is not one of the 15 member states of the Security Council of the United Nations, but African voices need to be fully reflected in the proceedings, and consultation need to be made for African wisdom and leadership, etc. And great leaders in Africa, especially a great leader like President Kagame, for example, need to lead Africa and lead the African nation to project the African voices to the United Nations General Assembly on the one hand, and especially in the Security Council. Now, the other thing, allow me to mention, is that while we always talk about securities on the one hand versus development, but these 2 things are integrally intimately integrated. They cannot be separated. And allow me to warn all of us, we are now already in the middle of this AI revolution, artificial intelligence. I'm very much concerned about the AI divide. And the AI divide will exist between humans, for example, you with very sophisticated chips embedded in your brain, I without, between companies, between governments, between militaries, between cultures, and between civilizations. What we need to do is to really accelerate whatever we do to make sure no country is left behind, especially African countries. When you travel throughout the corners of African continent, you have the worry that Africa is not fully integrated into this AI tsunami, AI revolution. We need to speed up. We need to mobilize all resources. And I think the open source, the AI development as represented by DeepSeek in China represents a new trend. That means lower cost, enabling all participants to play a useful role, and African continent and all the African countries have a choice.
After the Second World War, the Cold War dampened the enthusiasm, and this paralyzed the Security Council for a long time. Now, after the Cold War, we believed again in this dream of multilateralism, and we dreamt of Pacific international relations, and now we are back to tensions. And the UN system, the multilateral system, is suffering, has major difficulties. And you can also observe that the Security Council has been blocked many times by the veto power in the last few months and years. We also observe that UN agencies are having major financial difficulties. Large members of the Security Council are contesting the international order as it was constructed after the Second World War, and this leads to problems that seem hard to solve. But the multilateral system cannot be reduced to that. We can talk about multilateralisms in plural. There are other organizations, such as the Francophonie and others. I think what will happen in the following years will be a wait-and-see system where the UN will continue to be blocked with lack of innovation, lack of empowerment, lack of innovation, or those will gain strength. We talk about regional multilateralism, so I think these new organizations will give us new perspectives. Allow me to say one thing about Libya, because it was mentioned by two people. This situation is very complicated, and I think historians, when the archives will be opened, will do their work. We know that takes time for historians to do their work, but I think some truth will come out. For France, that's a situation where there were revolutions in many countries of the Arab world, and there were issues in Libya, and the leader was talking about crushing the revolution, and his own son was talking about blood flowing. When you see armored vehicles rolling in streets, what do? Do you intervene? The responsibility to protect, does it enter into force or not? I agree that intervention should be criticized, but sometimes you need to look at the facts.
There were 3 African countries in the Security Council at the time of that decision. If you go back and look at how they voted and why they voted the way they voted, you will then see that they did not have a consensus as the 3 of them. And you then ask the African 3 on the Security Council, what is it that can make them strong enough to maneuver in that moment? And between that time and today, the African three has changed a lot. And that change has been, one, the deepening integration of the Africa three to the African Union. So when you're sitting in the Security Council and you're one of the African three, if you get a very clear signal from the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, it emboldens you a great deal for you to say, look, I would like to do what you're telling me to do, but unfortunately, the African Peace and Security Council has decided, so our hands are tied. Sometimes even when Chair Moussa Faki would speaking for the Commission, but because the Peace and Security Council is quiet, we would use his words to say as if, Moussa, you are talking for the whole of Africa. And we would try and use that as a leverage point. We then had a unity with the CARICOM states, which was called the A3+, when St. Vincent came in and said, on the basis of Pan-Africanism, if the three of African countries agree on any issue, we will automatically vote for them. The difference between 3 members and 4 members in the Security Council is considerable. Now imagine a strong Peace and Security Council of Africa that is independent, that is decisive, that makes clear decisions in a timely way. Then next imagine that Africa has a criteria for the candidates for the African three on the Security Council, not just regional circulation, but you're coming there with capabilities, you're coming there with determination, you're coming there with a track record of pursuing African interests. So if those 3 were put forward by Africa of that nature, who could combine with CARICOM, who can talk on the basis of peace and security decisions, believe me, you will often see China and others in Security Council automatically side with the African three. You may not have a veto in terms of the law of the charter, but many, many times when you have that leverage, you have a de facto veto.
14 ans après l'intervention de l'OTAN en Libye,
14 years after the intervention in Libya, there is no government. 14 years later in Libya, we don't have 5 heads of state who were designated. They went to Tripoli to convince Gaddafi. They went to Benghazi. These are facts. It was possible to stop war in Libya. The Americans acknowledged that later on. The French did, the English did, the British did that. They accepted that it was a monumental error. And what happened? Libyan arsenals were dumped into the Sahel. I'm from Chad. I was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. President Deby sent people. They bought so many arms, including some 7 that can hit aircraft. And today, a big part that is infected by terrorism is the Sahel. This is what happened in Libya. These are facts. Of course, historians can analyze this, but no one can convince us that things are different. Because today, 14 years later, Libya is still a failed state.
As an African, in response to your Libya comments, I just have a few questions. They don't need to be answered, but they need to be asked. Who will write the history? Who will write the history of what happened in Libya? Africa must. Africa must write its own history. Maybe others will do the same, but already you are hearing from His Excellency Moussa Faki what they saw. What was the role of Africa and African leaders, and why could international actors not give them the respect of sitting at the table with African leaders? That was the least that could have been done. You know, what is the standard of living for Libyans today? Is it better today than it was before the attack? Is Libya secure today? Are the neighbors of Libya secure today? And the final question, who earns from Libya's resources?
My name is Khalid Moussa. I'm the Charge of Affairs of Sudan. It is undisputable fact that the biggest crisis, humanitarian crisis and security crisis in Africa, in Sudan right now, when you have 13 million people displaced, 5 million refugees, and there is a war crime committed in the country. I do appreciate by the government of Sudan what the former Commissioner of Africa, Mr. Moussa Faki, did. Regardless, the crisis in Sudan reflects the institutional weakness of Africa. It is a dark spot in the conscience of Africa. That because for the second consecutive years, it's still going on, Africa doesn't do anything for the Sudanese people when we see the suffering. And when we talk about the owning the resolution for African problem, this is a clear weakness and a spot on the conscience of Africa.
Your Excellency, I wanted your comment on Sudan. It is a huge humanitarian crisis. It appears it's a proxy war. How does Africa just respond, contain? What is the way forward?
What is happening in Sudan is dramatic. It's extremely acute, and certainly Africa has not done enough. But I would like to recall each and every one that in my former role as the chair of the African Union Commission, 10 days in terms of mission, I went to Khartoum. I met the military in all their different sections, including RSF, the political class and the civil society, and we put in place a team that supported different forces, political, social and military forces, to reach an agreement in August 2019, and they put in place a transition with a civil government which was led by Dr. Hamdallah. In October 2021, military forces, Al-Burhan and their deputy, General El-Meti, they did a coup and they removed the civilian government. This led the African Union to suspend Sudan from their activities. And this is what really happened. When war broke out after the suspension of Sudan, I personally went to Khartoum 3 times to discuss, to engage, to discuss with military forces which were at, to see how we can kickstart the transition process. And in April, there was the war that broke out. The president and the vice president. I would like to recall that RSF is a militia, but which was legalized by the Sudanese government as an army force belonging to the Sudanese army, and this is the truth in what happened. Therefore, external interference have become a manifest, and when 2 parties are using weapons and incredible arsenals and drones, so foreign interference is known. It's well known and it's developing, unfortunately. At the same time, we started a political process to try to bring together civil and military forces to sit in Addis Ababa, and there was another process, an agenda in Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, all those didn't bear fruit, and the war became worse, and today we are witnessing a real disaster, a humanitarian disaster. And which is more shocking is that today everybody is aware it is external forces, together with their weapons and ammunition, that are feeding the war, which has taken large proportions, and millions of Sudanese are refugees or displaced. The African Union tried their best. We don't have the political or diplomatic capacities. Even parties, let us recognize, sometimes they are privileged for reasons that are theirs. External forces, be it diplomatic or political level, more than regional institutions such as IGAD or African Union. So this is an unacceptable situation, and all forces should be unified so that peace regains. Parties should accept dialogues. Parties should accept dialogues to put an end to that bleeding situation, which is fragilizing such a huge country. I personally, it's a country that I know, but nobody could imagine that Sudan would enter into such a war. And the biggest threat is that external interference are becoming more and more a serious issue, and nobody is talking. This is very worrying for us, even for the African continent in the future. Thank you so much.
What an incredible conversation, and not an easy one, but an important one. I want to thank all the panelists. I'm just going to finish by reminding us that, you know, many of our cultures believe in the spirit of Ubuntu. You know, so it's very easy for us to lean back into that. I am because you are. That mutual respect stands within many of our communities. In Kenya, we have something called Harambee. How many of you have heard about this, the Harambee principle? And if you haven't, thank you, I see a couple of hands. The Harambee principle is when we strive together, we achieve much. When you stand alongside each other, you have extra vigor, energy, and you push harder. And so we have a lot within our own communities, our principles, that we can tap into to give power to African solidarity. Allow me to end with a quote from a great African leader. I can see no security for African states unless African leaders have realized beyond all doubt that the solution of Africa lies in African unity. That was Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah, how many years ago? And so as I look at this room and the power in this room, and many who are watching on screens in different parts of the continent and the world, as Africans, what are you going to do about this?